Welcome to St Nicholas's Church. This spot has been a place of worship for nearly 900 years. But this church is the third church on the site, and it was created in 1876-1877. So it's right in the middle of Queen Victoria's reign. It's a really interesting church inside, and it contains some lovely artwork from the late 19th, early 20th century. And that artwork has significance for two main reasons. First of all, the rector who commissioned this church was called Dr. John Monsell. And unfortunately, he didn't live to see the church finished or the artwork created. But he envisaged in his well-known hymn, O Worship the Lord in the Beauty of Holiness, the worshipping environment that you see in the church today. The second reason for the significance of this artwork is that it was created by artists and architects with great credentials in the ecclesiastical art world, and particularly of significance in the Anglo-Catholic field. And these people were of national significance, but interestingly, many of them worked and lived locally to Guildford. Some of them were even worshipping members of this congregation. So that brings a very intimate and different feel to St Nicholas's. When St Nicholas's Church was built in 1876, it was really quite bare inside, with white brick walls. And only gradually was decoration added as funds became available. So the work is not all of the one style. The first two pieces to be commissioned for the church were the Alabaster Pulpit and the font, which were carved by Thomas Earp, and he was one of the most eminent master craftsmen of Victorian England. His most famous piece is the Eleanor Cross, erected outside Charing Cross Station in London, but you can also see some of his statuary on top of the Colleges of Justice in Fleet Street. So as you can see from looking at these pieces, his work is what we might call high Victorian. It's very heavily carved. Some 12 years after the font base was created, St Nicholas's Church erected on top of the font a spectacular wooden font canopy, which was designed by Henry Woodyer. Now, Woodyer was an eminent architect of national significance, but he was also a Guildford man, and he'd become involved in the High Church Anglican movement when he was at Oxford, and his architect's practiced out of the High Street in Guildford. Inside the canopy is a carved column which raises with a pulley to reveal the font bowl and the water inside, and that's how we raise it and use it for baptisms. Woodyer was also a designer of quite delightful wrought ironwork, and St Nicholas's font would originally have been surrounded by wrought iron rails, as you can see here. These were removed in the 1970s, and the panels were relocated into the arcading beside the Loseley Chapel. But the spectacular lilies all around the top are now sadly lost. We have some idea, however, of the delicacy of Woodyer's designs in wrought ironwork from the screens in our chancel, which were made locally in Millmead in the 1890s. So they were actually made in St Nicholas's parish. Going back to the font, you can't fail to notice behind it the spectacular west wall, which was painted by Joseph Aloysius Pipit in 1900. The Pipits were a well-known family of ecclesiastical artists, and you can see their work in Hascombe Church, for example, also in Surrey. You can see that the west wall is almost pre-Raphaelite in style. It's very much taking its influence from the medieval period. One of the female saints on the right is actually holding a medieval organ in her arms. You can see the wounds of Christ in his hands and his feet shown as golden stars, and the blood which flowed from those wounds is shown in the chalice with a golden star above it. We can see this medieval theme continuing in the reredos at the back of the high altar, reinforcing the Anglo-Catholic High Church emphasis of St Nicholas. In a way, they were almost going back to pre-Reformation times. The reredos was made by the Ecclesiastical Art Company of Clayton and Bell, who also made the stained glass and the wall mosaic in the north aisle. In the 1880s, it was originally intended that the walls of St Nicholas should be completely covered in paintings and artwork. Indeed, they actually began to paint over the walls, and you can see some of that completed here in these photographs of 1920 decoration around the insides of the arches and in cartouches of paintings high on the nave walls between the pillars. All that was painted over in the 1970s. We don't know if it survived underneath the white paint or whether it's destroyed forever. Also taken away then was the rood beam, leaving the rood now just hanging from the ceiling. I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that there was a strong representation of nationally rated but locally based craftsmen's work on display in St Nicholas. The rood is such an example of that. It was designed by Sir Charles Nicholson, who lived locally in Blackheath, and he was the architect of Portsmouth Cathedral and designed the Lady Chapel in Norwich Cathedral, so he was a person of some renown. The statues of Our Lady and St George were designed and made by the architect William Randall Blacking and painted by the master glass painter Christopher Rahere Webb. Blacking and Webb met as students of Sir Ninian Comper, and they set up a studio together in Flower Walk just beside St Nicholas's Rectory, which is where these statues were made. They frequently worked together, producing in a number of churches and cathedrals sanctuaries of rare splendour, Blacking providing the architectural plans and Webb with the windows and the reredosses. Webb's work includes windows in St Albans and Southwark cathedrals and the George Herbert Memorial window in Salisbury Cathedral. Blacking, who also lived in Flower Walk, was consulting architect to Chichester Cathedral and also worked on St Albans Cathedral. It was Webb, who lived in Mount Street, Guildford, who painted the surround to the aumbrey in the Lady Chapel. Little work has been done on these artists as a group, but they're significant for two reasons. Firstly, they represent a time when the arts and crafts movement was flourishing in this part of Surrey, known as the Golden Triangle in that respect, and in St Nicholas's parish, where there are a number of houses by well-known arts and crafts architects like Thackeray Turner, Charles Boyce and Norman Shaw. These arts and crafts houses in our parish were particularly favoured by ex-Indian Army and ex-Indian Civil Service retirees who for some reason wanted to live in Guildford. Secondly, there were strong associations between the St Nicholas artists and even more famous artists and architects of national and international repute. Ninian Comper in the case of Blacking and Webb, Butterfield and Pugin in the case of Woodyer. This would indicate that the artwork in St Nicholas should be regarded as a complete collection and rated of some significance, and already some of this artwork has been lost or destroyed, so we really need to cherish what we have. I'd like to end today by taking you to my favourite piece of artwork in St Nicholas's, which is the icon of St Nicholas himself set into the chancel wall. It's not very big, it's under 2 feet high, and it's a most delightful and delicate carving of St Nicholas shown in his bishop's mitre, and he's with 3 children, as the legend of St Nicholas would tell us. But you can see how he's holding the baby up against himself with his left hand, and it makes a most appealing and embracing image. It was carved by Tom Wren of the Watts Studios in Compton, and Tom Wren was one of the most gifted members of that Potters Guild, and he's the one who created the very small image of G.F. Watts himself in the cemetery at Compton. So I feel particularly blessed to have this image of St Nicholas here, because there couldn't be a better one that symbolises this church with its arts and crafts connections.